All righty. Hello, everybody. It's Friday. It's the Democracy Stupid. I am joined by the fabulous John Nichols, who is, of course, the executive editor at The Nation, the associate editor of Cap Times in Wisconsin, and he's the author of books that, I don't know how to say this, go right at questions of money and power in America. John, it's great to be with you again. We've been together on radio a lot. It's great to be face to face.
You know, Edwin, it really is a pleasure. And I have to tell you, you're better looking than I thought.
Well, you write about such pessimistic things. I want to start with something that I've been thinking about. A good portion of the Democratic Party establishment, all of the GOP, and a good part of the media looked at the primary results in New York this week and immediately said the Democratic Party has gone off on an unelectable fringe. And I wonder if you'd care to correct the record.
I would be delighted to correct the record. There's an interesting thing that happens when progressives start to do well in primaries. They keep moving the goalpost, right? So initially, it was unimaginable that a immigrant from Africa who was Muslim and who was 33 years old could be elected mayor of New York City. And whoop, there you go. Mamdani's elected mayor of New York City. And then there's like, okay, well, that happened because he's got a remarkable personality or something. He's a great communicator, whatever. But it can't be replicated. That couldn't happen again. And then, of course, you saw in all sorts of special elections over the last year, and now in these primary elections, people who Mamdani has backed have won a bunch of races. You say, oh, well, okay, then that can only happen in New York. Well, but then Chris Rabb won down in Philadelphia. You've had other folks win in primaries all over the place. You've got progressives running very, very well in Senate and gubernatorial races around the country. And they're not just running well in their primary in the polling or even in actual primaries. When you pair them up against Republicans for November, they're running very well also. And so the bottom line is that at some point, what we have to accept is that the Democratic Party is a great big party. It's a national party, and you will have folks who come from different perspectives in different places. And this is, it's very funny to me that many of the people who say, oh, the party's going off the rails or it's going to extremes or whatever, they say, we've got to get back to the way we used to be. We've got to get back to the FDR coalition.
Get back to the way we were when we always lost?
No, this is the weirdest thing. Sometimes they say we got to get back to when we won, like with the FDR coalition, right?
Oh, with the Progressive Coalition.
And if you remember the FDR coalition, it included radical folks from New York City, as well as some pretty nasty folks from, some southern states. It included prairie populists from out in the Midwest. It was a very ideologically diverse party. I would say in some ways the Democratic Party, has moved to better places, I hope, than it was back in the 1930s and 1940s. But the fact of the matter is that the Democratic Party has always had a left. It's always had a center, and to some extent it's had a corporate aligned right. And so these fights have been going on. I wrote a book about it called The Fight for the Soul of the Democratic Party. And in that book, I spent a lot of time looking at the long-term decade after decade battles within the party. One of the things I want to emphasize to you is that sometimes those battles can be tough, right? They can divide the party, and we've had moments like that. But other times, they become sources of strength, right? The party moves forward. And I'll give you a good example. The party had a lot of divisions in the 1940s and 1950s over civil rights. There were Southerners who were rejecting civil rights, Northerners who really wanted to do it. At a certain point, the party made the choice. You can say you can look back into the late 50s and start to see some progress, the 1960 convention, some more. But of course, when Johnson signed the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts, those were major steps. But I want to emphasize, the party didn't die, it didn't go away, it progressed. And my sense is that on many economic issues, the party is now progressing. And
Yeah, I
yes, there are
feel that
going to
way.
be battles. There'll be battles, but I think where it ends up could be a stronger party.
Yeah, that's my impression as well. And I that the language is a difficult art, as you know, you're a writer. So the socialist word has so many different uses.
Mhm.
It's used by the right in one way, that the way that democratic socialists in New York are using that word, so the socialist part doesn't mean what it meant in Europe, when they came up with the idea. So I mean, they're going to have to let us know through legislation what they think it means, and I don't think we have a clue.
I don't think we have a clear clue, but I think we have at least some rough outlines. And
Yeah, yeah.
here's in the new issue of The Nation, Harvey Kay, the historian, writes a piece on Franklin Roosevelt's Economic Bill of Rights from
Hmm.
1944.
Hmm.
And if you look back at what Roosevelt proposed in 1944, his last presidential campaign, and one that he won quite
Yep.
overwhelmingly and brought in a Democratic Congress with him right at the end of World War II, he was proposing what would happen after World War II. And what did he say? People have a right to a job with good pay, right to organize a union, right to affordable housing, health care. That doesn't sound all that different than what a lot of contemporary progressives, some who identify as democratic socialists, some who don't. But what I'm telling you is, if you look at the history, what you're going to find is that many of the ideas that are being proposed now, that our friends at Fox News or other places may say are really radical, in fact, have been around for a long, long time. We've been struggling to get Medicare for all since the 40s.
Well, look, they've been around for a long time, and it turns out that the idea that people should have health insurance is actually a good idea. These are good ideas that have been around for a long time
Yes.
that you look at Fox News and they're saying are bad ideas, and let them keep saying it because
Well,
Americans like these ideas.
right. Well, in fact, I did a piece the other day. I wrote about Clara Valdez, who's running. She got one of the nominations in
Hmm.
New York, and she's very likely going to Congress to represent Brooklyn and Queens. She won her primary by a pretty big margin against a very credible opponent. And if you look at what she's been attacked for, and Republicans have been attacking her and saying, "Whoa, she's really radical. She's really a scary candidate."
Yeah.
And the things they're attacking her for are healthcare for all, and making education and housing affordable. And you ran down the list, and it's sort of, uh, I think that there are folks who, when they hear the S word, when they hear socialism mentioned, they immediately send alarm bells up and they say, well, whatever this person is talking about is dangerously radical. In fact, many of the things that again, our friends in right-wing media might identify as dangerously radical are in fact things that poll very, very, very well
Yeah, deeply
in
popular.
America.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Um, so many Americans look at the autocratic consolidation of power that we've seen in the last year and a half, in particular, the abuses of power, the self-dealing, the corruption. John, they look at the ubiquitous gold trim, and they ask themselves like, well, why isn't anybody doing anything about this? Like, I think that's an odd question, but I get it that they feel helpless. Um, and I agree that Trumpism is a virus, but the past year and a half, I think we've developed some pretty strong antibodies to that virus. And I wonder what you see out there, on the other side. Yeah.
It's a very wise way. As always, Edwin, you're a good thinker, and I think that this notion that you develop antibodies is one way. It's one metaphor to talk about it.
Yeah.
What I always say is that politics evolves, right? What you had in 2016 was something that was a certain
Mhm.
politics, and it was a politics rooted in the fact that neither major party had addressed deindustrialization and a host of other concerns that were making working class people across the country really scared about the future. this was in a moment where we already had machine learning and robotification, but AI wasn't quite as big a concern. It was also pre-COVID. But already there was an anxiety. People were, deeply troubled about where the country was headed. And you saw the churn that occurred in our politics where, Trump did very, very well in the Republican primaries, ultimately got the nomination. Bernie Sanders, an extremely different candidate, right? And those who compare Trump and Sanders miss huge, huge differences between these two men. But the fact is, he also identified this deep concern about deindustrialization, trade policies that didn't work, things of that nature. And so you had a moment where people were tapping in and saying, we want these things to be talked about. Both parties evolved, and 2020, Biden won, and by a reasonably good margin. 2024, Trump won by a narrower margin. But you end up with this reality that we're in a chaotic moment as a country. We know that fundamentals of our economics have shifted, that we don't have a lot of the industries we did. We have trade policies, sometimes tariff policies that make it more complicated. Now we have the arrival of AI, which has a tremendous number of people really concerned about their jobs, about society, education, communications. And all of this influences our politics. It's an evolution. Now, Trump's reaction to it has been, to say the least, chaotic, right? And it has also been,
about one thing.
Go ahead.
How can I use this to line my own pockets? He's been very consistent about that.
Yeah, making a mess. And the mess of things economically is a serious situation, because Trump's great argument for himself as a candidate was he knew how to do business and economics, right? You can like him or dislike him, but this was the selling point. He had written books about this stuff. Well, now as president, he's been sitting on top of the economy for a year and a half, and look at where things are at. People are, really struggling with inflation. There's no question that this mess of a war with Iran has made all sorts of things tougher. His tariff policies have made things tougher. There isn't a circumstance where workers feel that they're more secure. And you've got again, AI coming along, and an awful lot of people who feel like their government is giving things away to the tech billionaires without listening to them. So, end result is that I think we have this evolution of politics, and where the evolution has gone to now is a point where Donald Trump cannot argue that his approach is the answer. Now, he could when he was out of power, and he could in certain circumstances in the past. Now he is in power with a Republican Congress saying, give me more power, right? And the people are saying, this isn't working. We don't like it. And we really are looking, this again, talking hopefully in the language of the great mass of Americans, they're looking for an answer. The question is, will Democrats give them that answer?
Yeah, I'm afraid that he is providing an answer. It's a different answer. What he's saying is, don't listen to John Nichols. The problems that he's talking about aren't the real problems. The real problems are that white Americans are losing. And I am being effective in that. My Supreme Court has just this week allowed me to deport hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people, and you're going to see me do it. I think he's providing that answer in place of, he's posing that problem in place of the ones that you're talking about.
Yeah. And he's been doing this since 2015 when he came down that elevator, when he announced his candidacy. He's focused a lot on immigration policy. But here's an interesting thing, Edwin. While, yes, he does have a Supreme Court on his side by a 6-3 margin. If you look at the response to what happened in Minneapolis back in the start, Chicago, Los Angeles, other places around the country, the interesting thing about it is that the numbers have moved on immigration. People don't listen to Trump in the same way that they did on that issue. Now, that doesn't mean that people don't have concerns. Doesn't mean that people maybe are opposed. I mean, everybody's opposed to immigration reform. But what they have come to realize is that that simply, chasing after people, sending ICE out there, the violence, the cruelty, that doesn't make things better for anybody, right?
Yeah.
And I think there's also a dawning realization. I hear it a lot in the Midwest, and I'm, from the rural Midwest by background and out in small towns a lot. And I really do hear people saying, look, we're thinking more about this issue. And what we're thinking through on this issue is that immigrants have been essential to agriculture in this country. They've been essential to rebuilding a lot of our small towns, rebuilding neighborhoods and cities, bringing entrepreneurial and, just hard work, commitment, striving to a lot of places around this country. And so I think the debate is evolving. Doesn't mean it isn't doesn't mean you won't hear Republican attack ads. You won't hear cruelty. You won't hear all the all the worst.
Strands are part of our history too.
Yeah.
And we have fought to overcome them time and again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I do think like I said, this keeps going back to this sense that I have that we evolve. And I do believe that our politics has evolved on that issue, where now I think Americans are ready for a much more responsible, more humane debate. And the key for Democrats is to not operate from a point of caution or fear, but to say, look, immigrants have contributed incredible things to America. The immigrants have done a great deal to make this a better country. We are all, as John Kennedy suggested, except for our native peoples, we're all from immigrant backgrounds, right? And
willingly or unwillingly. Yep.
Yeah.
So John, I've been thinking about this evolution and the evolution of our parties. And the Republican Party has expelled members, and it has shrunk to a harder core that is less diverse and personally loyal to Trump. The Democratic Party's evolution is a little more complicated because there are two things I think going on. I want to get your sense. One, and I'm not even sure I would categorize it as progressive versus centrist. I would say the era of going to Washington to make a deal is over. Which when you had two vibrant and legitimate political parties was really the job. You go there, you represent what you want, and you get the best you can get. Understanding the other guys are Americans, we have to compromise, we have to figure it out. Let's make a deal was what you did in Congress. The Republicans broke that, and now the change that's happening in the Democratic Party is anybody who is stuck in that let's make a deal mold, the voters are saying you're an idiot. Those days are over. We want people who are going to go there and get stuff done, period. And there's that transition that's going on. And at the same time in our party, there's a generational transformation going on. And there's an overlap. Those circles overlap, but they're not identical. It's very hard to say which is which, but they're both happening. And so you have the Republican Party shrinking into this fist, and our party saying, we see that, and we are going to be ready to deal with you that way. We're not going to make a deal. We're going to go there and fight, and we're going to send a younger crowd to do it. And that has policy implications, as you point out. But I think that's happening all over the country, no matter whether it's a progressive or a centrist or not on the Democratic side.
I think you're right. And let me give you a little bit of history, and then let's bring ourselves back up to the moment where we're at right now.
Yep. And I love talking to you.
I love talking to you just as much, my friend.
Because of that, you've got the history. Yeah.
Maybe some of it at our best. But let's take a look. To understand the Democratic Party, let's take a look at the evolution of the Republican Party. The Republican Party, founded in 1854 in Ripon, Wisconsin, my state, was founded with some pretty noble goals. It wasn't perfect, but they really did support, they wanted to at least stop the expansion of slavery, right? And then in the post-Civil War era, sympathy with support for enslaved people, bringing them into the American political process, abandoned with the abandonment of Reconstruction, horrible. But still, this reality that within the Republican Party, there was an openness to a sympathy on the part of many of its elected leaders to civil rights, right? And so if you go to
Hence the
the
South
early
was all
19,
Democrats. Yeah.
what?
Hence the
Yeah,
South was all Democrats.
right. And so if you look at the late 50s, early 60s, the incredible coalitions that were formed there. And the interesting thing was Northern Republicans often made Democrats, Northern Democrats, better on the issue, right?
Mhm.
They said, don't you go compromise in there. Um, let's let's take a
Certainly true
stand.
in Chicago. Yep.
Right, let's do the right thing, right? And so if you look at the coalitions on the Civil Rights Bill and the Voting Rights Act, those were Northern liberal Democrats and many moderate and liberal Republicans against reactionaries, right? And segregationists. And so that was a point where the compromises ended because you had a coalitional politics.
Right.
Unfortunately, the Republican Party is no longer, it just doesn't have those people in it anymore, right?
Yep.
You don't have moderates and liberals in any kind of real numbers. And, some people try to say, well, Susan Collins is sort of a moderate or something like that. But look at how she votes on issue after issue. As it's been said about her, she's always there when you don't need her. And so she'll occasionally cast a moderate vote, but it's not on those critical transformational issues, the issues where the country has to move forward. So now, for better or worse, we have divided party. We have two parties that are on different tracks. If
Right.
one of those parties, if the Democratic Party in this circumstance moves into a compromising mode, it's compromising with extremism on the other side, right? It's not compromising with the old Republican Party. It's compromising with people who are taking very, very extreme stances, often stances that are at odds with, a fair distribution of our resources, that are wrong-headed on issues of foreign policy, and that are very troubling as regards democracy. And so you've got a situation where Democrats have to come into this circumstance with a clarity, with a moral clarity. And what they have to say is, yeah, you got to, if you want to move this country forward in positive ways, we can talk with you, we can work with you. But if you're talking about harming people, right? If you're talking about economic injustice, social injustice, racial injustice, if you're talking about, doing severe damage to the environment, if you're talking about a foreign policy that, it does, damage not just in countries around the world, but then blows back on this country in very, very rough ways, as we've seen with so much of the Iran war.
Yep.
The Democrats should be saying, they should be very comfortable in saying no, right?
Nope.
They're just not going along. And that's this younger generation, impatient perhaps,
Yeah.
not as willing to, look for that easy compromise, is saying no. Let's draw some lines. Let's say who we are, and let's go to the voters with a clearer sense of what the two parties are.
Yeah.
Now, there's going to be real debates about that, Edwin. You came up through politics. You saw those kinds of debates. I respect you
I
because
was in them,
that.
and I love that kind of fighting. I do.
Yeah.
I do. It's in my bones. I love it.
But it's a fight for the soul of the party, right? And
So,
if you can make the Democratic Party a party that is really committed to economic and social and racial justice, saving the environment, getting us out of stupid and unnecessary wars, and defending American democracy, respecting, this vision of a representative democracy that really does work for the great mass of people. If the Democrats can move to that at this point in our history, and do so with an optimism, with a sense of real possibility for the future on core issues, Medicare for all, or at least some expansion of Medicare, some expansion of our health care, a real vision for addressing the affordability crisis, a real vision for housing, and frankly, a real vision for treating human beings decently, and making our democracy robust and strong. You know what? That doesn't sound bad.
Sounds
I
great
don't
to
think.
me. And we have to make this connection for people. I think and I believe it to my core, that the outcomes that you're talking about, better outcomes from people, are the result of a well-functioning democracy, because the people you send actually work for you. When you break it, as it was broken for so long in your state of Wisconsin, the
Oh yeah.
legislators end up working for the map makers and the money, and not for the voters. And you get worse outcomes. So a thriving democracy and better outcomes for people go together.
Yes. And you know what? It's better outcomes for Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives and independents, people from across the spectrum. Because if you have a robust, healthy democracy where you are not competing to please your campaign donors or the gerrymandering map drawers, but you are actually competing to say, who's got the best ideas? I dare suggest to you that we have conservative friends, maybe libertarian friends, who've come up with some good ideas along the way, right? Ending the drug war as an example, and legalizing marijuana, things of that nature. Often some of those things started with our libertarian friends. But if our libertarian friends can have some good ideas, then could our social democratic friends have some good ideas as well? And might we have a politics where we could say, look, let's not compromise values. Let's not compromise on our ideals. If we're going to look for reaching out, let's be open to ideas that work well, right? And one of the ideas that works well, I would argue, is treating healthcare as a right and saying that everybody in this country, no matter what their background, no matter what their economic status, is going to get the healthcare they need. You start with basic things like that, and you're going to find an incredible level of sympathy. The other thing you're going to find an incredible level of sympathy for is making sure that people can, achieve whatever they can as regards their educational goals. There's great high support for making sure that people who work hard make enough money to have housing and to have the food they need, to have the transportation they need. These are not radical ideas, but they are the ideas.
They're American.
They're the ideas that Franklin Roosevelt talked about in an economic Bill of Rights.
All right, John, we have only a few minutes left, and you wrote a fabulous piece about, not a current character, but Tom Paine. And, we are in an era of plenty of summer soldiers. So I'd like just to get your take on why Tom Paine still matters.
He matters so much. The one thing about Tom Paine is he's a very satisfying figure, because when you look back to the founding of the Republic, you can see an awful lot of aspects of many of the founders that are imperfect, right, or flawed. And that doesn't mean you dismiss everything they did, but you have to, there's nuance there, and that's okay. We have an honest discussion about where we've come from and how we've evolved as a nation. At their best, many of our founders recognize that. They recognized that we needed to amend the Constitution. They recognized that we needed to change. But the one thing about Paine is that he was seeing so far ahead of many of the other founders. And it's just an interesting thing. He was absolutely committed to democracy and voting rights. He really believed in it. He believed in it as a way to open things up. He was, his writings on the condition of enslaved people in this country from, the very beginning, distinguished him from a lot of the other founders. His respect for women, which he had to grow into. That's an interesting thing. He had debates, and instead of rejecting what was said, he said, "Oh, you know what? That's a pretty good idea. I'll take that in." And so the end result is that you look at Tom Paine and you find a founder who, in many ways, I would argue, is more suited to today than many of the other founders. In fact, I'd suggest this: if there's a founder for the next 250 years, it's Tom Paine, right? And I get excited by that. The piece I wrote, for what it's worth, did focus on the fact that in one of the last elections of his life, the last midterm election of his life, he was turned away from the polling place, and they told him he wasn't an American, or he didn't qualify as an American. And, you know, he fought that, and it was a very frustrating thing because he had lived in other countries, but he was living in New York State and had been there for a number of years. And he was being turned away from the polling place, not because of his residency status. He was being turned away because somebody didn't want him to vote, right? Because they knew where his stands on issues were. And
Yeah.
what I write in the piece about is that we find ourselves again in a situation where there are efforts to deny people the right to vote, not because there's a real problem with their voting status or something like that, but because you just like to narrow the electorate. Some people want to have a smaller electorate because they think it's going to be easier for them to win elections.
Yeah, some people includes Donald Trump. Let's just be
Yeah.
clear. Yeah, yeah. So I mean,
Yeah, that's a maybe too generous a phrasing.
yeah. I mean, but also, you know, I mean, you're a writer. You write wonderfully, and you impact politics. And Tom Paine was the best writer amongst those founders by far. And it impacted. I mean, Washington was smart enough not to have, you know, his own words read to the troops. He had Paine's words read.
He had Paine's read. Yeah. And Paine recognized the power of the word, i.e., that you could reason with people and they would choose to do brave and bold and exciting and new things. Yeah. I mean, if you read Common Sense, which I really recommend as a good activity for July 4th, 2026, if you read his pamphlet, Common Sense, it is an argument against monarchy. And frankly, it's an argument against oligarchy. It's basically saying there's a better way to do things. If you read his American Crisis, which is what the pamphlet that Washington had read to the troops, it's an argument for a patriotism that can be difficult and demanding and challenging, but you do it because you want to achieve great things. And if you read his pamphlet, less known, Agrarian Justice, which was written in the 1790s, you find, you should check it out. An argument, this for a crazy thing, Edwin, this will shock you. He argued for something, you know, that you might call social security. And he said that we should tax wealthy people and make sure that we had a country where older people could get the care they needed, younger people could get access to education. And why did he argue for that? Because he said that's how you achieve democracy, when people have, you know, at least some level of security, right? Some basic level of security, so that then they can go into the great debates about the future of this country, not, you know, in the worst of circumstances, but with a place at the table. And so if you read Agrarian Justice, you get a vision of the 21st, maybe even the 22nd century.
Well, Common Sense I keep on my desk, but I'm going to go look for Agrarian Justice. Hey, as always, it's great to talk to you. I really appreciate these conversations. And this time it's great to do it face to face. And you are in the stacks of the Library of Congress because you're doing another book, which is fabulous.
I can't think of a better place to talk to you from, my friend, because of all the people I know and talk to in interviews like this, you're one who so appreciates history and so appreciates its intersection with contemporary debates. And what an honor to be with you. And hey, happy 250th.
Same to you. I know we will celebrate it in the spirit it deserves.
I hope so.
Bye. Bye.
Hey, thanks, my friend.